Hello everybody, welcome back. It's another episode of Mega Project. This one, we're tackling another ancient mega project because this one's all about the Colosseum. Let's just jump. Before we get started though, if you've got suggestions, by the way, for future mega projects, let me know in the comments below, upvote the ones you like, and I might just crack on with those. But for now, the Colosseum. The roar of the crowd baying for death, the smell of sweat and blood hanging in the air. Few buildings can ever hope to match the kind of all-encompassing experience that the Colosseum must have offered. A place of horrific violence where thousands lost their lives, but also an engineering marvel with a design on which most modern stadiums and arenas are still based. Today, this grand monument to the ancient world still stands majestically. A visit to the Colosseum today couldn't be any more different than what a visitor just under 2,000 years ago would have experienced. The intense, bloody combat has been replaced with intense scrummaging for photos. But if you close your eyes and allow yourself to imagine the year 80 AD, you can still feel the ancient presence. You can still hear the beating drums and the rattling of swords as the gladiators enter. Only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world still stands today, the Great Pyramid of Giza. And while the Colosseum was never held in such high regard, it has now been included in the new 7 wonders of the world, along with Petra, the Great Wall of China, Machu Picchu, the Taj Mahal, Christ the Redeemer, and Chichén Itzá. The largest amphitheater ever built was constructed close to the Roman Forum in the Italian capital, Rome. The Forum, once home to a collection of government buildings, is itself a wealth of historical artifacts, but much of it now lies in ruin. Its neighbor, on the other hand, has survived the test of time. Well, just about. The 1,940-year-old Cathedral of Combat was constructed using travertine limestone, tough volcanic rock, and brick-faced concrete. It was started by Emperor Vespasian and completed by his successor and heir, Titus. Sometimes known as the Flavian Amphitheater, it had a maximum capacity of between 80 and 87,000 spectators, depending on which source you consult, but typically averaged between 50 and 60,000 people for a performance. If we take the low estimate of 80,000, only 7 football stadiums across Europe have ever been built with a higher capacity, and this was built nearly 2,000 years ago. It is a location that people continue to flock to in enormous numbers. In 2018, 7.5 million people visited the Colosseum, making it one of the most popular tourist sites anywhere in the world. Unlike many amphitheaters which sprung up across the Roman Empire, the Colosseum in Rome lies smack bang in the middle of the city. This would have been completely impossible had it not been for the Great Fire of Rome, which burned for 6 days and destroyed great swaths of the city in 64 AD. Emperor Vespasian pounced on the opportunity, and the land was requisitioned for the most ambitious amphitheater the world had ever known. Now, the money for this had to come from somewhere, and in 70 AD, during the Great Jewish Revolt, the Romans laid siege to Jerusalem, and after 4 months they forced their way into the city, destroying much as they went. When the Romans returned home, they did so rich in plunder. An inscription in the Colosseum attributed to the emperor even states that it was constructed using the victorious general's share of what was taken from Jerusalem. And just in case you're wondering, there is no mention of how the generals felt about this donation. Work began on the Colosseum sometime between 70 and 72 AD. By the time the emperor died in 79 AD, work had been completed up to the 3rd story. The 5th and final level was completed the following year, and the Colosseum hosted its inaugural events in 80 or 81 AD, again depending on the source. We don't have a lot of information about these first games, but there are reports that over 9,000 wild animals were killed during the inaugural games. Peter would have a field day. The Colosseum was constructed with 100,000 cubic meters of marble, and according to sources from the time, it was transported to the building site with the help of 200 bullock carts and a legion of slave labor that was said to include between 20,000 and 60,000 Jewish slaves. That's certainly not to say it was all done by slaves, though, with Rome's finest masons, ironmongers, and craftsmen working on the ambitious project. It's estimated that 1.1 million tons of concrete and stone went into the construction, with much of it held together by 300 200 tons of iron clamps rather than mortar. There's almost no information about the cost involved in the construction of the Colosseum, but experts estimate it would cost between $750 million and $1 billion if it was built today. The study used for a book, The Colosseum, suggested that the foundations alone would cost $57 million to lay today. The building received further additions with the next emperor, Domitian, who ordered that a gallery be added at the very top of the Colosseum to increase capacity even further. He was also responsible for the hypogeum, which is the series of tunnels and cages beneath the structure that were used to house animals and gladiators, and that's something we're going to be coming back to just a little bit later. In 217 AD, another fire raged in the area, causing significant damage to the Colosseum and destroying its upper wooden levels. It would not be until 240 AD that this pearl of the Roman Empire was restored to its full former glory. The last mention of gladiatorial combat in the Colosseum came in 435 AD, but animal hunts were recorded as late as 523 AD, but by that point, Rome was a really different place. The fall of Rome in 476 AD was a cataclysmic event that profoundly changed Europe. An empire that had stood relatively unchanged for 500 years quickly disappeared. The Dark Ages that followed were dark not only for the lack of written record, but also for the bleak conditions that succeeded the Roman Empire. The Romans were by no means angelic in how they ruled, but their example of education, sanitation, and indeed construction, which has spread throughout Europe, quickly collapsed. Rome itself was sacked mercilessly, but certain buildings like the Colosseum and the Pantheon escaped with miraculously little damage. Perhaps even the invaders saw what magnificent structures these were and kinda felt like leaving them alone. By the 6th and 7th centuries, the role of the Colosseum couldn't have been more different. A chapel was built within its walls, and the central area section was used as a cemetery. Its iconic arches and their natural alcoves became housing and workshops for the local people. Now, in 1349, an enormous earthquake hit Rome, causing the outer south side of the Colosseum to collapse. Much of the fallen stonework was removed and used in other projects around the city. Indeed, some of the marble used in St. Paul's Basilica in the Vatican came from the Colosseum. In the 14th century, a religious order set up residence inside, and, well, they remained there all the way until the 19th century. The Colosseum is an elliptical shape, 189 meters long and 156 meters wide, with a base area of 24,000 square meters, which is about the size of 3 standard football pitches. The outer wall is 48 meters high, about the same as a 15-story building. Interestingly, because of earthquake damage, what we see as the exterior wall today was, in fact, the original interior wall. In fact, what is visible today is significantly less than what was originally there, which is just another fact that makes the Colosseum even more extraordinary. If we compare what we see today to its past, half of the outer perimeter is completely gone, and there is, of course, no wooden seating at the very top, and much of the skeletal structure inside has been badly damaged or is just now completely missing. It's not possible to walk freely around the interior of the Colosseum as people once did. People sometimes remark that the Colosseum appears a bit smaller than they imagined. Maybe that has something to do with the CGI Hollywood movies, but the structure itself is really smaller than it once was. The perimeter of the building originally measured 545 meters. This was larger than it is today because half of the outer wall is missing, but the basic shape is still there. It's now just a bit of a crooked shape, while the central arena is an oval 87 meters long and 55 meters wide. The area is surrounded by a 5-meter high wall, after which the tiered seating begins. But what we can see is not quite everything. Drains were built 8 meters below ground level, allowing for water to flow out into Rome's famed sanitation network, which, by the way, we've done a whole video about that did really well. Kind of a surprise hit to me. On top of this drainage system came the foundations made of concrete. The depth of the foundations changes considerably depending on where you are in the Colosseum. The areas below the seating and where the outer walls once stood have foundations set 12 to 13 meters below the surface, while underneath the arena area it's only 4 meters. This is for the quite obvious reason that the outer sections had to support considerably more weight. What is particularly surprising about the Colosseum that you might not even think about was how efficient it was as a venue that could accommodate tens of thousands of people. As I said at the start of this video, the Colosseum has provided a blueprint for stadium construction around the world, and while method and material have obviously changed a lot, much of the original design actually remains the same. There were 80 entrances in and out of the Colosseum, 76 of which could be used by regular spectators. 4 were reserved for the emperor, his family, and other dignitaries. These entrances, and the staircases which led up to them, were all numbered to help people find their way around, just as you would find in a modern arena. Tickets were given as a fragment of pottery with seat numbers on it, which directed the spectators to their seats via a series of vomitoria, which were passageways that led from the staircases. It was an incredibly efficient system that allowed a quick flow in and a quick exit as well. Little side note here, by the way, if the word vomitoria sounds a little like an English word, well, you're exactly right. The word actually comes from the Latin for rapid discharge, and it is from this that we take the English word vomit, but let's get back to the Colosseum. The seating structure within the Colosseum was an excellent indicator of social hierarchy. Special boxes to the north and the south were reserved for the emperor or the benefactor of the games, as well as the Vestal Virgins, who were the priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. The hearth was a sacred flame in the city that was kept alight at all times, and it was said that if it was ever to be extinguished, Rome would fall. These were very important women. Either side of the boxes were senatorial seats with enough space that Rome's finest could bring their own chairs. There are still examples in the Colosseum where individual names have been engraved into the rock. I guess you can't steal somebody's seat if their name is literally scratched into the stonework. The Romans obviously did take all of this very seriously. As we move upward in the Colosseum, the level in Roman society decreases. The section located above the senatorial seats was the Maenianum Primum for the non-senatorial noble classes, or knights. This was followed by the Maenium Secundum, which was reserved for ordinary Roman citizens, but was itself divided into 2 depending on your position. The Immum was the lower section for wealthy citizens, while the Summum above it was for the poorer citizens. There are also examples of specific areas being reserved for certain social groups such as soldiers on leave, scribes, priests, and even boys with their tutors. The Maenium Secundum was the final section to be added at the very top. This gallery was for the common poor as well as slaves and women. This section was composed either of steep wooden benches or simply standing room, depending on what point of history we look at. A tier was then divided by low walls into multiple sections known as mania, which were then subdivided into wedges or cunei. And finally, promise, a row was referred to as a gradus. Therefore, on your ticket or piece of pottery really, you would have a cunus, a gradus, and then a specific seat number, a rough format that is still used throughout the world today. Now, although the shows were ticketed, they were almost always free. The events were paid for by individuals, sometimes the emperor and sometimes local businessmen, perhaps looking to curry favor with the demanding Roman population. What's more, it even came with free food. A wide variety of meat would have been on offer, including pork, venison, lamb, and chicken, but also plenty of fruit and nuts, as well as bread rolls. As for drink, it would have likely been some kind of watered-down wine that was served. As strange as it might sound with our binge-drinking cultures today, the Romans never drank straight wine. It would have always been watered down, quite simply because they didn't want to get too plastered too quickly. There were also plenty of prizes on offer, with small wooden balls hurled into the crowd. These would contain money or food, but there is evidence that some even contained deeds to a house or a small apartment. Further, when the temperature soared, the crowd were treated to pausiones, a water mist that had been scented with balsam or saffron. There was also a giant awning known as the vela, which could be drawn across certain sections of the Colosseum to provide shade. Other than the horrible violence that you have to watch, this actually sounds really nice. If only they'd just play music or something. The hypogeum was a late addition to the Colosseum and couldn't be seen clearly today. Meaning underground in Latin, the hypogeum is the series of tunnels and cages set over 2 floors underneath what was once the arena floor. Before contests, gladiators and animals were kept below ground in these cages, then brought into the arena with the aid of 80 vertical shafts. This is an aspect of the Colosseum which is often overlooked, but it would have provided quite the spectacle with a complex pulley system and other machinery to raise or lower what was in the arena. As many as 60 large revolving cylinders, each 2 stories high and requiring 4 men on each level to turn, known as capstans, were used to raise or lower items, people or animals between the hypogeum and the arena floor. This was sometimes as straightforward as parts of sets needed for specific performances, but sometimes involved large animals such as elephants and lions. Around the outer rim were a further 28 smaller platforms which would have only been used for scenery. There is evidence of an early form of hydraulic system, as well as a clear layering of construction which suggests the hypogeum went through 4 separate major phases of building work. Experts have described the hypogeum in full swing as resembling an old-fashioned ship with ropes, cables, ramps, hoists, and counterweights used in a seamless combination. And it really needed to be seamless, as a small mistake in front of the emperor could mean that your day began working below in the hypogeum and ended in the gladiatorial arena. Now, we often think of shows in the Colosseum as simply bloody-minded mayhem. At times, it certainly was, but there was also a great degree of dramatics involved, which ranged from battle reenactments to hunts involving wild animals. The early years of the Colosseum also saw grand naval reenactments, where the site was flooded to add authenticity. It's not exactly clear how the Colosseum would have retained the water, but perhaps water from a nearby aqueduct was constantly pumped in. However, large-scale flooding became a thing of the past when the hypogeum was first built, as this would have flooded the area below the arena floor. The most popular contests were, of course, the gladiatorial battles. These captive men, and sometimes women, were forced to fight to the death in front of a crowd screaming for death. By the time the Colosseum opened, gladiator combat had evolved from freewheeling carnage into well-organized spectacles. These could vary from single combat between 2 fighters to larger groups pitted against one another. But let's bust a few myths while we're talking about gladiators. Firstly, while most of the early gladiators were slaves, this seems to have changed around the turn of the millennium. Graves from 1 AD show that free men began to volunteer for gladiatorial combat, perhaps lured by the thrill and the enticing money on offer to the winner. Secondly, the thumbs down gesture has always been considered a death sentence in the Colosseum, but historians have argued that, in fact, the thumbs up may have meant that a gladiator should finish off his opponents, while a closed fist or even a thumbs down might have meant mercy. It is something we'll probably never know for sure, but it's interesting that it's the opposite of what we'd expect. Possibly. Lunch intervals often saw the most gruesome acts. Those who had been condemned to death were brought into the arena and either killed quickly, or more often than not, by condemnation of beast, the act of putting somebody to death by letting a wild animal loose on them. It doesn't matter how glorious the construction or how regal the Colosseum appears, it's difficult not to come back to what happened in the main arena. It's estimated that as many as 50,000 people died within the Colosseum walls. Many of these were people who were put to death because of religious persecution, though recent evidence has suggested that the number of Christians executed in the Colosseum may have been much lower than the traditional narrative. The first full cleaning and repair in the Colosseum's history began in 2013 and was a partnership between Diego Della Valle, heads of the shoe company Tod's, and the local government. This involved cleaning and restoring the arcaded facade and replacing the metal enclosures. This process was completed in July 2016. The arena floor was also replaced in 2018, and the hypogeum was restored and opened to the public in the same year. The Colosseum does remain to this day one of the most astonishing buildings that humans have ever constructed. It's not just because of its size or its style, but because it is one of the few buildings that still breathes its ancient history. It is a painful history, and one that certainly shouldn't be ignored. Dreadful things occurred within those walls, and yet it continues to fascinate visitors in the millions. Quite simply, standing in the central arena with those towering walls around you and the ghosts of nearly 2,000 years nearby is unlike any other experience on the planet. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, you know what to do. Smash that like button. Don't forget to subscribe. If you've got suggestions for future mega projects, you also know what to do. Go down into the comments below, let me know, upvote the ones you like, and I will probably make those. And as always, thank you for watching.